From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters.
You're under arrest.
Hello?
Back the up.
Hello?
It's 911. Dude, you're under arrest.
Hello?
I know. Stop.
Hello?
Okay. Hello, 911?
Hi, where do you need the police?
This is a 911 call on the morning of December 28th, 2016. Dafonte Miller, a young black man in Whitby, is calling for help, telling an emergency operator that he was being assaulted by two white men, Michael and Christian Theriault, on a residential street. During the fight, one of the men, Michael Theriault, an off-duty Toronto police officer, got control of the phone and spoke to the 911 operator.
He started calling the police. We're on top of him. You're the wrong person, bro.
Okay.
We'll see you. Please get the police here in an ambulance now.
The call is a glimpse into what happened that night and served as a piece of evidence in the trial against the Theriault brothers, a 3-year-long saga that has taken on a greater meaning in Toronto. The case is part of the societal reckoning that's happening right now in 2020. Questions of anti-black violence by police accountability, and systemic racism. Here are the established facts of the case, as handed down by Ontario Superior Court Justice Joseph DeLuca. Dafonte Miller, Michael Theriault, and Christian Theriault got into a violent confrontation that winter night after the Theriaults believed that Miller and his friends were trying to steal from their family truck. The Theriaults chased Miller down. Justice DeLuca says the confrontation turned into a one-sided fight as the brothers hit Miller with their fists and a metal pipe. Miller was severely beaten and injured. His left eye had to be surgically removed. On Friday, the verdict. Michael Theriault has been found guilty of assault, while he and his younger brother have been acquitted of charges of aggravated assault and obstruction of justice. Miller says he'll remember the trial this way.
It just kind of felt like the case was against me, you know? It became about everything else but that night.
And Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders, with questions to answer of his own force's handling, spoke about community trust.
We have a lot of work to do as law enforcement, and when we look at what's going on in today's environment, there are a lot of people that have concerns. Our organization has done everything we possibly can when it comes to maintaining public trust.
Today, we're breaking down the verdict with the Toronto Star's crime reporter, Wendy Gillis, who has covered this case since the beginning. And we're talking about how this one case, involving the Theriault brothers and Dafonte Miller, has become a flashpoint of a much bigger conversation about racism, policing, and justice in this country. Wendy, thank you for making the time to talk about this case.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So to recap the judgment by Justice Joseph DeLuca, off-duty Toronto police officer Michael Theriault was found guilty of assault, but not of aggravated assault as he was previously charged. And then Christian Theriault, his brother, was found not guilty of aggravated assault. Both brothers acquitted of obstruction of justice. The judge spent several hours explaining his decisions. Did it really boil down to the probability of these charges? That was certainly a word that was used again and again. And of course, in any criminal trial, we have to think about beyond reasonable doubt, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've really honed in on kind of one of the major themes of this decision. Justice DeLuca was very careful, as you said, he laid out this judgment. It was over 4 hours, lengthy period of time to have us sort of wait on what the ultimate decision was. But obviously, he wanted us to really understand his reasons. And part of his reason is explaining, I'm a criminal judge and I have to judge not only on the evidence that's before me, but also what that evidence tells me, and does it convince me that this happened beyond a reasonable doubt. We hear this a lot in kind of like legal shows and criminal procedurals, but the onus is on the Crown prosecutor to prove their case. The defense doesn't really have to do anything if they don't want to. They can mount a defense. They can, for example, put the accused on the stand, which happened in this case, but doesn't always. But ultimately, the onus is on the Crown to prove that something happened. And not only that, it probably happened or it likely happened, but beyond that sort of questioning of whether it did. So, all of that said, this judge was able to explain both that he thought it was likely or probable that there was a more violent assault that happened here, that it was likely that some aspects of this happened in a way that he couldn't reflect in his final findings. But nonetheless, I think it's helpful to know that here's his reasoning. They sort of get a glimpse sort of inside of his head.
And of course, the bar, again, for any criminal trial is not probable. It is beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the bar that he has to meet every time.
Absolutely, yes. And so in a number of circumstances, that threshold was not met. In one very crucial area, the judge did find beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael Theriault had assaulted Dafonte Miller. And so that's why we saw that conviction today.
When it comes to that assault conviction, Justice DeLuca says Michael Theriault's defense of self-defense, and I'm quoting him here, razor thin, and that he was not acting in self-defense nor in the course of a lawful arrest. Why was that conviction downgraded from the initial aggravated assault?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, the razor thin comment really struck me right away as soon as I heard it. He's saying that comes back to the probability aspect of this too. You know, he was saying that already, like, sure, he believed it hadn't been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking right now. During the trial, we heard testimony from forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Pickup, and that's medical evidence. That's really often quite reliable. Judges rely on that kind of evidence. And he said that while it was possible that the injury that Dafonte Miller suffered to his eye was caused by a pipe, the pipe that we all know about now that was found on the scene, it was more likely that his horrible eye injury was caused by blunt force trauma, probably at least one punch. For that reason, the judge wasn't able to conclude that this was an aggravated assault. There just was too much doubt in his mind about it.
After the verdict, of course, there's been many different takes about this. You also spoke to Dafonte Miller in a conference call. What did he think about this verdict?
Yeah, I mean, Dafonte Miller has always struck me as just very thoughtful, fair-minded. He mentioned, you know, he doesn't paint all police officers with the same brush today, which I thought was just sort of a classy thing to mention. But he came down sort of a middle of the road by saying, yes, he was disappointed, like many of his supporters, that Michael Theriault and his brother were not convicted on all of the counts, and also that Michael Theriault was not convicted of a more serious assault charge. But he did make mention that, you know, we can't forget that this whole case started with Dafonte Miller being arrested and charged. And today he saw the officer who literally placed the handcuffs on him on that night be found guilty of a crime. And so I think for him, he described it as kind of a step forward.
I remember the night when this happened to me, I ended up getting charged, you know, and now we're in a situation where an officer has been held accountable to some extent. There's a lot of people are in my position who don't get the same backing that I got and don't get to have their day to really have any vindication for what they're going through.
He also acknowledged the broader context that we're talking about here, which is we are in the middle of a unprecedented sort of reckoning with policing and anti-Black racism. And he said a lot of my brothers and sisters, they don't get this kind of outcome. In fact, they die and police officers walk away. So I think for him, this outcome was a positive thing.
I think even the way that this case is being viewed and the way people feel about it, Justice DeLuca mentions this, that we are currently in this context about policing and police accountability and anti-Black racism. When Justice DeLuca spoke about it, in what context was he using it and situating it even around this idea of race?
Great question. And because the way he handled this was kind of complex. He, within a few minutes of this ruling, he acknowledged at the outset that this is coming during a really fraught time. And it's interesting because I've been covering this case ever since it came to the fore, and it's always been really fraught. Some of my early reporting talked about how, you know, this case is symbolic for the same reasons we're talking about it now, but it's really more acute. And I think he mentions that and says he's so pleased with the public attention and the media attention that this is getting. He thinks it's a good thing, but at the same time, sort of the other side of the coin is that he cannot make decisions on anything other than the evidence that was heard in that courtroom. He cannot be swayed. He kept saying, you know, it's not my task his task is to decide on the evidence. It's not his task to decide on the larger issues or perform kind of like a public inquiry into policing and racism.
Right. It's the Theriaults that are on trial. It's not an inquiry into the structure of policing or how they police Black people.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that was really astute to, well, actually, I think it would have been quite negative if we hadn't made any mention of that, because judges are able to make kind of comments about the broader context in which their decisions are made. But I also think it helps to sort of defend him a little bit against people who might say, oh, well, he found him guilty because of the context or the environment that's happening, or that he let the brothers off on more serious charges because of problems within the justice system. I think he was trying to just sort of enable and educate people more about what the court does and what he as a judge can and cannot do.
There's this added context following this discussion about race and the world that we're living in right now, especially in racialized communities and how they're seeing this case. And I'm going to reference a tweet from criminal defense lawyer Anna Maria Ananijor, and I'm going to quote it because she put it quite eloquently of what people are thinking about in this case. And she says, "We are fighting a community perception and in large part the reality of Black lives that police who commit crimes are never held accountable, especially when the victims of those crimes are Black men." Now, following that tweet, you also spoke to Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders about the verdict. How does Toronto Police think that this verdict will play when it comes to issues about trust in police?
So we did hear from Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders very soon after this decision came down, and he made a very frank acknowledgement that he knows that this decision is going to have an impact on the relationship between Toronto Police and the Black community. He said, as chief, I can't deny that this matter will have an increased strain on the relationship between police and the community, specifically the Black community. I think Mark Saunders was right to acknowledge that this aspect of that case, there are still very serious, outstanding issues involved in this case. From the beginning, it has never been only about the actions or alleged actions of Toronto Police Constable Michael Theriault and Christian Theriault. It's always been about the larger reaction to it, kind of the possibility that there had been some kind of cover-up. Why wasn't the Special Investigations Unit, the Ontario Police Watchdog, called in earlier? Why did neither police service that was involved in this incident call them in? 3.5 years later, there are still those questions, and only now that the criminal trial is over can we get those larger examinations going. So there are still a lot of questions in this case.
There is, as I understand it, there is an external investigation into why SIU wasn't called in, right?
That's correct, yeah. So there's always an investigation whenever the Special Investigations Unit is called in on a case. There is always a necessary internal review that happens within whatever police service is involved. In this case, Mark Saunders and the Toronto Police Board opted to have an external review done. They said, okay, we don't want to do this in-house, so we'll get another police service to do it. There are still a lot of criticisms about, whether it's completely unbiased to have another police service do that review. I know that there's a lot of criticisms that you can sort of raise about that.
There's questions of cops investigating cops.
Exactly, and that's always been the problem here. So Waterloo Regional Police is going to be conducting the external review, and I think what the community and myself as a reporter is looking to have answered there is kind of an accounting for those early hours and why the Special Investigations Unit wasn't called in, because that was not addressed at trial. This was not the proceeding for that, but it was frustrating. As someone who's covered the case, again, it was frustrating to not get more insight into why neither police service called in the Special Investigations Unit when really they should have under the expectations.
Following that idea, too, of this idea of police conduct after the fact, and the fact is that Michael Theriault is a Toronto police officer, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention John Theriault, Michael and Christian's father, and how he fits into the story. He wasn't on trial, but the way this case is viewed does involve him. Can you explain how John Theriault fits into all of this?
John Theriault was working for the Toronto Police Service in the Professional Standards Unit, which is kind of the police service's own sort of internal investigative unit. So they're the ones who investigate police officers who have serious complaints against them and bring them to the professional misconduct tribunal. They also become involved in cases where there are criminal allegations against a police officer. So they know. They're kind of the front lines of when cops are in trouble themselves, they're usually aware. And so certainly when this incident happened, and when neither Toronto Police nor Durham Regional Police called in the SIU, there were questions about whether John Theriault had made some calls. And I should stress, we don't have any information to that effect. But certainly there was a specter of suspicion because of his role within the Toronto Police Service. Additionally, he also was part of that interaction that night. I mean, that was his home, and he spoke to his sons about what happened. And so certainly there were also questions about whether or not he may or may not have, like I said, made some calls or intervened in any kind of way.
And John Theriault has now retired, as I understand it. So it's likely that some of the details of how that played out, we may never know.
Yeah, that question was posed to Chief Mark Saunders today. And I don't know that I understand exactly the extent to which, as you said, John Theriault would now be required to participate in any sort of investigation. I know that in the past it has been challenging. Police officers can sometimes avoid professional misconduct charges, for example, simply by retiring or quitting. Then the police service no longer has jurisdiction to sort of probe the events. So that may be a challenge. I'm hoping that perhaps maybe there was some interviewing that happened before this, but that remains to be seen.
So as we look forward now, the fact remains is that Christian Theriault acquitted of both charges. Michael Theriault convicted of assault. What happens now? Does he get to return to serve as a Toronto police officer?
No, I think this is a long road out yet. Michael Theriault has been suspended with pay since he was arrested. So what happens next is that there will be a disciplinary hearing for Michael Theriault. He is still employed by the police service. We've seen recent examples of police officers getting quickly fired in the United States, even before perhaps there are criminal charges. That does not happen typically in Canada. You might remember the case of James Versillo, who shot and killed Sami Yatim and was convicted of attempted murder. He was not immediately fired, and in fact, he resigned. And I think a lot of people were surprised at that. And so certainly we're going to see something similar again here, where we have a Toronto police officer who is convicted of a crime, but is still technically on the force. So I think it'll be several months out, maybe longer, before there's any kind of proceeding. I've covered several of these types of hearings. They can stretch on for a really long time. And the range of consequences are kind of like there's firing on one end, and then there's sort of like a talking to on the other end, and then there's a lot in between. So, whether this warrants a firing, I guess we'll just have to see.
Wendy, you've covered many complex cases over the years. Do you remember one that was as tense and took on the significance of race and violence and policing, especially in the context that we're all living in right now, than this Theriault trial?
I've covered a few cases now where there are vulnerable communities who historically have a fraught relationship with the police, including the Bruce McArthur case, where, we had a serial killer who preyed on gay men in Toronto's Gay Village. That had its own dimensions and was really quite kind of like a flashpoint case. This is different. I mean, this is anti-Black racism. This is, larger questions being raised about police accountability. It really kind of highlights and underscores so many of the issues that we're talking about now. It has kind of all of these elements. And one point that I think is important to get across too was made by Dafonte Miller's lawyer today, that a lot of the evidence that was relied on today was thanks to an independent witness. And, usually they're really great to rely on. And, Dafonte Miller was, in lots of ways, it was fortunate that there was someone who was looking out their window and saw what happened. But it happened to be a white man who has a position of authority. He's a firefighter. And Falconer kind of raised some questions about, we still needed a white man to help out in terms of getting this conviction. There are still a lot of questions to be asked about who we trust and whose evidence is relied upon in court. And so I think, as several of Dafonte Miller's supporters said today, I think there's still quite a bit of ways to go.
Wendy, thank you for your reporting on this trial, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's Wendy Gillis, the Toronto Star's crime reporter on the Theriault trial, what comes next, and how this case speaks directly to the big questions we're having in society around policing and accountability. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.